a rugged land, rivalries and vendetta, scheming and intrigue.
Their politics were ferocious.
A time of art, a time of enlightenment, a time of war.
War as my business, peace would ruin me.
Soldiers of fortune.
They fight for profit, not for glory. They fight to survive.
Armor and steel. The time of the night.
You know, this is not covert warfare.
We want to do the 15th century armour some justice.
The scourge of medieval Italy. The dogs of war. The condottieri. The medieval world. The 5th to the 15th century. Tim Sutherland is one of Britain's most experienced archaeologists. He and a team of specialists try to understand medieval life by exploring the realm of the medieval dead.
We have a classic view of the storybook medieval life. We don't hear the stories about the common man trying to keep his family alive. Archaeologically speaking, we can now focus in on the medieval dead people. You couldn't help almost look through their eyes thinking, what did they see? How did they die?
The condottieri were the paid soldiers, the mercenaries of medieval Italy. Theirs was a world of constant warfare, the golden age of the armoured knight on horseback. It was a life of training, of pitched battles, and gallant cavalry charges, all against the backdrop of one of the richest settings of the entire medieval period. We'll explore the evidence, the battlefields, and track down the lost artifacts of the world of 15th century Italy, the world of the condottieri. It was a time of change. After centuries of the Dark Ages, Europe was emerging and in many ways beginning to bloom in the Middle Ages. Art, architecture, science. The Renaissance took hold and blazed. Nowhere more so than the very crucible of this new cultural age. Italy in the 15th century wasn't a single country, more a region. It wouldn't be unified for hundreds of years.
Late medieval and Renaissance Italy has a very special attraction. It's got a magnetism, but it was an incredibly violent time as well. It was as medieval as the Middle Ages.
Beauty and violence. It's perhaps this contradiction that makes Italy so compelling. And it's in this volatile cultural climate that the world of the condottieri came about.
I've always wondered when I think about medieval Italy. I mean, we look at the rest of Europe based on the feudal system, but Italy wasn't like that. And I've often wondered what it was really like. How did it all sort of come together? How did it come together to become one of the richest regions in Central Europe?
Medieval Italy was different to the rest of the continent. It was fragmented into small, though extremely wealthy, city-states in both north and centre, and of course the Papal States. This was incredibly complicated, complex, colourful, highly cultured and remarkably wealthy, sophisticated part of the world.
These powerful independent states in a relatively small region gave medieval Italy its distinct feel.
The heart of everything was the city. And in the earlier medieval period, the story was of these cities controlling just outside their walls, then a few villages beyond this, then the whole valley, then the trade routes to the next city.
But even then, each city-state was still riven with disunity. Competing factions vied for control, family against family.
This was the world of Romeo and Juliet, of the Montagues and the Capulets, rival families bidding for domination of the city and the power and the political prestige and the money from trade involved. It was really vicious political struggles, literally cutthroat.
If you found yourself in the wrong neighbourhood of a medieval Italian city, you watched your step. Families had to look after their own. Homes became fortresses.
Even within the city walls, there are other fortifications. The famous towers that survive in just a few parts of Italy, these were family fortifications. Because the politics was so ferocious and competitive, families who could afford it felt the need to have a fortification in case they had to quarrel with another family.
You couldn't rely on law enforcement to protect you. The city militias were as factional and corrupt as everyone else. Instead, families, merchants, anyone wealthy enough, took matters into their own hands. The stage was set for the condottieri.
They haven't got a standing army. They're winding down the local militias because of political faction fighting. So they come to this conclusion then that we will actually employ outsiders, contractors, mercenaries.
The families got rich enough to think, well, this is a mug's game. Why don't I hire some mercenaries who'll do this dangerous job for me? And we get the beginning of professional soldiers, mercenaries, taking a leading role in Italian warfare.
Not knights pledging loyalty, nor feudal peasants fulfilling their oaths.
All of a sudden, you've got a system. You're paying somebody else to fight on your behalf, and these are mercenaries.
You see this system create itself over a couple of centuries from something that initially is quite ad hoc hiring of mercenaries, and then by say 1500 it is quite an elaborate system. It is embedded in political life. There are lawyers who are making their career actually facilitating this kind of a system.
The name by which these warriors for hire were known was peculiar to medieval Italy.
These mercenaries were led by people who had a contract with the city-state, the employer, a condotta, and they were therefore the condottiere. In other words, the condottiere was a military businessman who raised troops, having had a contract to do so from an employer, which was usually a city-state. That's what the word means.
Military contractors, just like the ones we hear about today.
You know, in the modern context, we look at wars of the 20th century. You know, you make the argument that the country that cannot support war economically will ultimately fail.
David Murphy of Ireland's Maynooth University lectures in military history and strategic studies. He sees the parallel between the condottieri of medieval Italy and the military contractors of 21st century warfare.
The fascinating thing about medieval Italy is that they're extremely rich, and you bring in outsiders that you will actually, and you will create and empower a military class, a military caste even, that you will buy in to do your military service.
Historians like David are able to gain a powerful insight into the world of the condottieri. Some of the contracts, the original condotta, still survive. They reveal a wealth of detail.
You see some of them still remain in places, the archives say it, in Milan and Florence, whatever else, and they're quite substantial, I mean physically substantial documents, because you have to get all this detail on before it was signed off.
The condotta was initially a simple agreement, securing military service for say 60, 90 days, in exchange for an agreed fee, usually paid monthly in Italian florins. Huge sums, 1,400 a month in 1360.
In questo momento preciso.
1,600.
Abbiamo bisogno di lui.
1,800 a month by 1420. With so much money involved, and clerks, negotiators, lawyers, it's no surprise that the contracts became ever more complex. Drawing them up was an occupation in itself.
You see them graduate and get much, much more complex. There will be clauses put in terms of, say, if people get injured, extra pay, what that extra pay will be if you lose a limb, extra pay on top of that. So it gets very, very complex. And also in terms of, say, food that has to be provided, times of payment. So it goes beyond from just being a very simple kind of like text to quite an elaborate one.
Most of all, the condotta stipulated exactly what kind of assets the employer was buying. What kind of fighting forces.
The main parts were the elite, well-paid, extraordinarily well-equipped, fully armoured cavalry men-at-arms. They are the dominant element. They are the battle-winning element.
At least half of every condottieri army was heavy cavalry. At no point in the medieval period was the armoured mounted knight more prevalent.
It's heavily armored Italian knights fighting other heavily armored Italian knights. That was the main way of fighting.
The knight and his horse is a powerful emblem, a mythological symbol to us now, representing a remote time, something more noble.
The medieval knight on horseback, it's such a powerful image. In medieval Italy, this was it. This was the guy. And of course, it was such a strong image that it's stayed with us until today.
The grim reality of warfare is the same for every fighting man throughout history. Yet somehow, the emblem of the mounted knight transcends this. Even for Wallace Collection Arms and Armour curator, Toby Capwell.
My first reaction after being, incredibly impressed by the image of fully armored knights on horseback was wanting to be one of them. I wanted to be a knight a long time before I wanted to be a curator.
Toby has been riding horses since he was 11, jousting in full armour for more than a decade. The relationship between armoured knight and horse fascinates him.
The horse informs and permeates every aspect of medieval life. The story of the knight is the story of his horse. It should be, chivalry, chevalerie means horsemanship. That's all it means. And a knight at his very heart is a horseman before he's a warrior. He's that as well, but a knight is nothing without his horse. Professional men-at-arms live with their horses, and they're with their horses practically all of the time. There are fabulous illustrations of mercenary captains marshaling their men-at-arms, getting ready for battle, and the horses are just stood around in the encampment. They're pegged right next to the tents where the guys sleep, and they're getting their horses ready before they've finished dressing themselves. So the horses are part of your team just as much as your other people are.
In condottieri warfare, there was a huge emphasis on armoured horsemen. At least half of every force was heavy cavalry, and the country itself was well suited to fighting on horseback.
It made a lot of sense to fight on horseback in Italy for a number of different reasons. They have the Great Plains of Lombardy, which is perfect for cavalry operations. It's hot, the equipment is heavy, so fighting on horsebacks to minimize personal exertion makes a lot of sense.
On the battlefield, condottieri cavalry fought in squadrons, 20 or 30 men abreast, ready to maneuver or charge in formation. An irresistible force.
They had that shock tactic, the ability to, cruise missiles, to just slam into the lines of their enemy. But heavy cavalry did a lot of other things too. They're very mobile on their horses. These are very high quality horses. They could get round an army. They could attack their opponents from the sides. And of course, they're elemental in pursuits and routes, taking prisoners, taking ransoms. That's all part of the business of warfare.
En masse, condottieri cavalry might have been unstoppable, but individually, mounted men-at-arms were not self-sufficient. Each needed assistance, to maintain and operate in complex armour, let alone feed and water his horse. Because of this, a condottieri force was made up of small but mutually supporting teams, often comprising just 3 men.
The basic 3-man system that was practiced in the late 14th and into the 15th centuries makes a lot of sense, because you've got your main armored man, who is the heavy hitter, but he needs someone to guard his sides and rear. When you're in the full armor, you can't see very much, you can't hear very much, you can't feel very much. You can hit really hard, and you've got a lot of power in the horse and in your equipment, but you need someone else who can be like your radar and be looking at the other direction and telling you a bit more about what's going on.
Above all, condottieri knights had to practice. When they weren't in action on campaign, they had to train in order to survive on the battlefield.
To fight well in armor and to fight well on horseback is a full-time job. A good horseman needs to ride 3 hours a day, and a good fighter, a swordsman, a practitioner of the knightly fighting arts needs to train every day just as much as a musician has to practice every day. So this is a full-time job if you're going to be good at it, and that's why, it's one of the reasons why knights and fully armored men-at-arms got paid more than everybody else.
As well as horses, condottieri commanders needed the best equipment their employers could afford. Most of all, this meant arms and armour.
Across Europe at this period, we see there's a huge emphasis on development of armour. The condottieri themselves fight battles not for glory, they fight for profit, they fight to get a result, they fight to survive. So with that in mind, they are willing to invest in armour development.
Italian armour is generally considered to be some of the best available in the medieval period. In that respect, it's probably reached its zenith. It's the top of its game.
The Wallace collection is one of the largest and most important in the United Kingdom. It contains more than 2,000 objects, with many of the finest and rarest examples remaining now anywhere.
Italy is the golden age of men in full plate armor, no doubt about it. Well, certainly from a visual and sensory perspective, all these armors are very highly polished, so you'd have a blaze of reflections in the hot Italian summer. This is not covert warfare. This is the most honest, upfront, and immediate form of warfare you can imagine.
The helmet was one of the most important pieces of armour. It not only protected the condottieri, but dehumanized him to an opponent, increasing his psychological impact. By the late 15th century, the condottieri wore the best helmet ever developed for the mounted knight, the armet.
Italian knights of the condottieri of this period were so closely associated with this helmet. The armet was defined by having these hinged cheek pieces. And this is an ingenious design because they can open up to accept the wearer's head, and then they lock closed around the lower face. So the whole helmet is really enclosing the whole head very closely, very, very well fitted, and getting all of this shape and getting this helmet to work is technically extremely difficult. This is really the best technology of the time.
But it wasn't just the helmet. The condottieri spent most of their time while employed on campaign wearing their armour. So they wanted the best protection, the most practical, the most comfortable, and of course the most prestigious they could afford.
Italian armour of this period is like a Lamborghini. It's beautiful. It appears simple. It does the business. It's a classic example of where something being entirely functional comes across as supremely beautiful because you can see that it works.
Original medieval armour is uncommon enough. Italian medieval armour is extremely rare.
All 15th century armor is rare. I mean, almost nothing survives. Far less than 1% of everything that was made in the 15th century survives. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of complete knightly armors were produced in Italy in the 15th century, and 13 survive?
Of the very few armours that now exist, most have been preserved due to sheer fluke. A number of these in particular survived through an amazing story of detective work. Author and historical researcher David Nicol owes much of his interest in the medieval period to the work of his father. Patrick Nicol was also a writer, but he was best known for his work as an historical illustrator. One of his colleagues was an important figure of the arms and armour world in the 20th century, Sir James Gow Mann. Sir James had an illustrious career. He'd been the director of the Wallace collection, and he'd played his part in one of the most astonishing discoveries of historic armour. In the 1930s, he visited a small village outside Mantova in northeastern Italy. Now David Nicol wants to fulfill an ambition of long standing, and in a way, to tie up a loose end some 3 decades old.
The sanctuary of Santa Maria della Grazia, it's Our Lady of Mercy, Gratitude. It's an important religious centre, but it's not a place that many people come and visit. This is not a touristic area, but it is important for those who are interested in the history of armour. Indeed, my father always wanted to come here, never was able to do so, so I feel in a strange way I'm doing it for him.
It's a medieval sanctuary of the Franciscan order of monks, and it's home to a unique collection.
I think this is amazing. This is amazing. I had no idea. I feel inclined simply to say, wow.
Faces stare down from the walls. Faces enduring suffering. The condemned, the hopeless, the lost. The many dozens of mannequins are hundreds of years old, dating back to medieval times and after.
This is a quite extraordinary place. I wanted to visit here for many, many years, but I had no idea it was quite so remarkable as this. I have never seen anything quite like it before.
To modern eyes, they're more than unusual. They're grotesque, bizarre. But they're not all horrific. They're representations of people from all walks of life. Men, women, rich and poor, clergymen, soldiers. Each represents a soul saved. The figures are expressions of thanksgiving.
They all tell a story. They are all donated by some person who was grateful for being saved from a sickness, disease.
Sir James gazed up at these figures, just as many generations had done before him, each of them costumed as the person would have been in life. Realistically crafted in papier-mâché or wax. Maybe, some thought, a little too realistically. There were mannequins here depicting medieval knights in full armour.
They looked at these statues without realizing that some of them weren't, in fact, statues. They're actual, unique suits of armour, extraordinarily rare and beautiful things covered in paint and dust and quite difficult to see. And that is, in a sense, where the story of these armours really began.
Several extremely rare armours, complete suits, had lain under the noses of the locals here for centuries. The armours were carefully taken down for restoration. the wax and paint had to be painstakingly removed, almost like archaeology.
I have to say, if my father had been able to come to this place, he would have been bowled over by it.
But where did the rare suits of armour go? David will follow the trail to see for himself. Medieval Italian armour is rare now, but in the time of the Condottieri, it was produced on an almost industrial scale. The workshops of northern Italy would have been dark and noisy places, as the smiths worked at feverish paces to keep the condottieri men-at-arms equipped.
It's one thing to appreciate the armour for the quality and the workmanship, but what's it like to actually make? What about the people that made it? What was it like to be a medieval armourer? Beating sheet metal day in, day out. The heat, the grime, the strength to do this hour after hour, day after day. It takes an unbelievable amount of strength. And sometimes you wonder whether you're capable of doing such a thing. So I wondered what it would be like to go and have a go myself.
To do this, Tim heads to Chesterfield in Derbyshire. He's come to a 21st century armour workshop, the home of White Rose Armouries.
Nice to meet you,
White
Dave
Rose
Hewitt.
Armouries.
Excellent. Hey, shall I have a brew before we start?
Kettle's on, mate.
Dave Hewitt is a 21st century master armourer.
So Dave, how long have you been doing this?
For my sins, 32 years now. I used to be an accountant and I hated it. So I were into reenactment and I couldn't afford any armour, so I found some scrap road signs and decided to make my own. So my armour had got give way and all sorts of stuff inside on it. And I made it in my bedroom and it put a strain on me marriage sort of thing. So.
But 3 decades on, Dave's work is now among the most sought after in Europe. He makes armours for museums, collectors and reenactors.
I wanted to make good stuff. I didn't just want to do it as a job, because I don't think you could do this as a job. This is a calling almost.
Over the years, Dave has taught himself the skills that were used in the guild-protected workshops of 15th century Italy.
Today, I mean, you've got me and a couple of lads working in this little armoury here. It was nothing like that. I mean, they reckon Misaglia brothers in Italy had got permanent staff, about 3,000 of them working. But then you've got your journeyman armourers, probably another 2,000-3,000 cottage industries, specialists making hinges, buckles. Can you imagine the amount of buckles that you'd require?
I've always been fascinated by armour because it's a piece of art in itself.
It is, of course it is. It's you're making an exoskeleton, you're making a living sculpture.
So, what are you going to get me doing today then?
We're going to make a simple breastplate with a placket, typical 15th century style.
One of the most vital pieces of a condottiero's armour was his breastplate. It was usually in 2 overlapping sections. The placard was the lower piece.
You're going to make most of it and I'm going to watch you.
What Dave is aiming to do is to show Tim how to recreate the characteristic form and line of Italian armour. He's already marked out the basic pattern. A 15th century medieval workshop might have had some water-driven machinery, and they'd have used a charcoal furnace. For speed, Dave has modern power tools and gas fire. But the main way of creating the form of the armour hasn't changed in centuries. It's time for Tim to make some armour. The first process is called sinking. Under Dave's eye, Tim is stretching the metal into the convex shape that gives the armour its strength. Constant heating and beating keeps the steel malleable.
So there, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's just have a quick gander at it.
Tim's beaten out the depth of the basic shape. Now it's time for the next process, smoothing out the lumps and bumps left by the sinking. For this, he uses one of Dave's special bespoke hammers. It takes steady hammering and a feel for the metal to gradually flatten the surface out without losing the overall curve. It takes time. Medieval Italian workshops would have rung to the sound of hundreds of hammers like these. Condottieri forces were well served in armourers. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Italian armour making grew to be internationally renowned. But how did this come about in such a small region?
One of the reasons, most basic reasons why Milan and that northern Italy became one of Europe's most important centers for the production of armor was the geography. If you look at what you need to make armor, obviously you need good sources of iron ore. You also need forests, though. You need forests for your fires that you're going to use to make the stuff. You need forests to make charcoal. You need charcoal, the carbon in charcoal, to make iron into steel. And you also need a confluence of rivers. You need rivers to power the water-powered grinding and polishing and trip hammering equipment. And you need rivers to transport your product in and out.
And the scale of production was extraordinary, especially considering the Industrial Revolution was still 2 centuries away.
Milan, a conservative estimate shows that in any given year in the 15th century, the Milanese armor-making community was producing something like 25,000 armors a year. And on an individual workshop basis, that's 1 armor a day. That's an extraordinarily organized industry.
David Nicole is on the trail of some of the last remaining medieval Italian armors. After months of careful restoration, the suits were reassembled and finally displayed together again, as they had been over the previous centuries. David's father was a contemporary of Sir James Mann, who documented the story of the Sanctuary of the Madonna delle Grazie armors. But he was never able to see the collection for himself, so David now completes the journey for his father.
Well, here we are outside the Diocesan Museum in the northern Italian city of Mantua. I've been waiting many, many years, in fact decades, to come here. Oh, wow. Okay, this is special.
The collection represents a real story of survival and a lasting testament to the skills of Italian armourers of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They show the richness and style of Italian medieval armour with a wealth of tiny detail, including many of the individual armourers' marks. This is exactly what the richest condottieri fighting men wore on the campaigns of the high medieval period.
Well, here we are, really, surrounded by the best quality armour that is going to be worn by the best equipped condottiere leaders. This is the high point of the armour, the armourer's art, but also the high point of the condottieri period, the pinnacle. This is what they reached as a complete military elite.
No one knows now to whom these armours belonged. The Madonna delle Grazie, the Madonna of Mercy, was the protector, just like any believer who had reason to give thanks for recovery from an illness or misfortune. Condottieri soldiers here made their own tributes in gratitude.
They're not, as far as we know, from a particular battle. These are donated for gratitude in thanks for their safe return from some campaign or some battle. Thanks to the Virgin for saving my life, and here is the piece of armour which protected me. You note the shape here. It's very simple, classic, simple, functional. It worked, it did the business. This is a good, strong chunk of metal, but they could churn these things out in numbers, and they exported them all over Europe.
Back at White Rose Armouries, Tim has almost finished planishing. The placard is ready for final shaping. Tim's creasing the metal over to create the waist. A skirt made of other plates or lames would have hung from this to protect the midriff. A fine grit grind gives the bright finish that a condottiero noble would have expected.
So there it is, Tim. What do you reckon to it?
I can't believe we've made that, although you keep saying I've made it, but
I haven't made it, you've made it.
It's phenomenal that you can get something that round out of a piece of flat steel. I still can't believe it, and it's taken a day.
It's beautiful though, isn't it?
It is.
And you can see it works. And it's to do exactly what it says on the tin.
So that's a perfect fit.
Squeeze into it. You see you've got your survival zone in there now. That's not touching your flesh.
No.
So any impact on there is going to be transferred through there
all around,
and transferred into your softer flesh down here.
That's right.
So all your vital organs are going to be safe and sound. All that trauma is going to miss them.
It's been a real privilege, and to work with somebody who knows what they're doing is an even more of a privilege, because obviously you've been doing this for a long time. Thank you very much. It's been an unforgettable experience.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
However useful mercenaries were on the battlefield, an employer had always to be wary. Condottieri leaders could be charismatic and ambitious.
I think for condottieri leaders, it must have looked like a land of opportunity, because when you consider you've been paid to provide military force to very wealthy employers who don't have their own military force, therein lies an opportunity. And you see sometimes they get drawn into kind of wider politics that shouldn't really concern them.
Intrigue was all too common. In 1478, the Pazzi family plotted to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici by turning his own condottieri against him.
The whole idea is that when Lorenzo's at Mass, he will be taken out, and then also key members of his family will also be taken out, and it'll all be not a bloodless coup, a bloody coup, and power will change.
Only it didn't work out that way. Lorenzo survived, rounded up the culprits, and sent a powerful message to his enemies.
And then there's a series of very gratuitous executions on the main square in Florence, where they actually pitched them out of public buildings to hang them, having kind of semi-disemboweled them first, so that when they come out the far end of the rope, their guts will spit out onto the square. So very, very graphic. But again, for a condottieri leader, this, if he's willing to take those kind of risks, it could be spectacular success. But when it goes wrong, it goes very badly wrong.
In the last years of the 15th century, times were changing fast in medieval Italy. The economies of the individual states were developing, and people were beginning to see beyond constant intercity conflict. But it needed something to happen, something to force the change. The catalyst was invasion. Europe too was evolving, kingdoms vying for power. Charles VIII of France invaded the Italian peninsula, and the Italian states vowed to come together to fight the French. Condottieri, who had previously fought each other, now fought under the same banner. The scene was set for one of the last great set pieces in the story of the Condottieri. From Mantova, David heads southwest. Here in the Taro Valley is where the Condottieri cavalry played their part against the French invaders. Two armies in this valley. Two armies on opposing sides of the river. The weather was turning bad, a portent for what was to come.
This was an Italian army, a very mixed Italian army from many states, but facing, or attacking indeed, an invading French army which was on its way home. It was not retreating, it was just on its way home. The French had chosen their line of march carefully. They were protected on one side by hills and woods, and on the other by the river. Now, the only way the Italians were going to be able to do this was to charge across the river.
The battle was fought over a huge area across the valley, with the French force extended in line of march along the road. The river is just as wide as it was back then, though the shallows and shale beds have changed. There's enough for David to go on though, as he seeks out the approximate area where the spectacular events took place, epitomizing the flashing spirit of the Condottieri cavalry.
Well, there's the riverbed, the River Taro. I was here 30 years ago. I was a bit younger then.
The patched-together Italian army was commanded by a veteran condottiero leader, Francesco Gonzago, the Duke of Mantova. It was he who ordered the attack across the shallows of the river to surprise the French.
One of the obvious places to cross the river, who wanted to make a charge and to attack the flank of the French army as it went across, was the ford. And there was a ford here opposite Oppiano. And I think it probably still exists, although the riverbed, the riverbed moves a lot.
But that night, the weather finally broke. Rain, thunder and lightning lashed across the hills and valley. The ford the condottieri wanted to use flooded.
Gonzaga, in command of the Central Division, decided not to go across the river at the ford. So he shifted to his left, upriver, and charged across at another smaller ford, which for whatever reason he decided was more suitable.
Hundreds of condottieri knights and men-at-arms waded their armoured horses through the river to attack the French flank.
This magnificent, sparkling, twinkling, steel-clad horde, they must have looked superb. But they flounder a bit. They get across, and then they have to attack without any time or space to reorganize themselves. So it was something that didn't really quite work. Must have looked marvelous.
A spectacle it surely must have been, but for all their dash and valour, the different condottieri leaders just weren't used to operating under a single command.
This was the same old thing you find with medieval history, and also for centuries to come. It was too complex. They didn't have the ability to send messages between each other. Put simply, it got in a muddle for various reasons. And ultimately, the battle was really a draw. A very bloody draw.
It was the beginning of the end for the condottieri. For 2 centuries, they had fought small wars, city on city, family on family. But national wars, on a much larger scale, were something they couldn't adapt to. The nature of warfare too was changing for the armoured horseman in the twilight of the medieval period.
It's amazing really, because we're at the end of our period, the end of the medieval period. The knight in armour is at the top of his game. A few years later, all this fades away with the advent of gunpowder and weapons. The armour is not good enough to last against ballistics. And so what happens is all these knights in armour fade away, and that's the end. They've just gone.
The Italian wars raged long into the 16th century. And in this cauldron, slowly, a sense of Italian nationalism emerged. But with it, a sense of responsibility. All classes of society were expected to contribute something, either in terms of money or effort and blood.
We've got to either modernise, or we must go back to a purer idea when you don't rely on mercenaries. A man fights for his city, or indeed the whole concept of Italy. So there was a change here. It's silent. All you really have is birdsong. However, it was here that, in a way, an era ended. The era of the condottieri.